In my previous video, I described the skepticism regarding dietary oxalates. This skepticism extends from scientists, such as this one at McGill University, to healthcare professionals, such as this MD PhD.
Oxalates! Yeah, everything from my hair falling out to my toenails curling is caused by oxalates. Don't blame oxalates in your diet as a normal part of your diet for any harm. They are a necessary part. They are a necessary part of being human. We need them.
But as I talked about in my previous video, there is an association between dietary oxalates and the development of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and chronic kidney disease. Now, an association does not necessarily prove that it is causal.
It certainly isn't causal.
You need a randomized controlled trial for that. But in the meantime, are there any other lines of evidence that might point to oxalates causing a problem? And the answer is yes. You have case reports. For example, this one here, oxalate nephropathy from cashew nut intake. This was a case of a 63-year-old woman who was referred to a nephrologist because of decreasing kidney function. As part of her workup, the nephrologist considered the patient's diet and quickly discovered that the patient was eating quite a lot of cashew nuts, about 4 to 5 handfuls per day. This resulted in a total oxalate intake of about 400 milligrams per day, which is about double the American average. In addition, her physician noted that she was on relatively low calcium, about 600 milligrams per day. This is important because calcium can bind to oxalate in the gut, thereby reducing its absorption. By the way, why was she eating so many cashew nuts? It was because she had learned from a television show that cashew nuts were supposedly good for constipation. And besides, everyone knows that nuts are healthy, so the more the better, right? Well, her doctors were able to convince her to stop consuming the cashews. They put her on a low oxalate diet, and they had her supplement some calcium. And after doing this, her kidney numbers improved significantly, but unfortunately she was still left with residual kidney disease. You can see that here on this bar graph tracking her serum creatinine levels. Creatinine is a measure of kidney function, and you want your number to be low, below the line that you see on that chart. And so 4 months prior to starting her cashew nut consumption, you can see that her kidney function was completely normal. And then after 4 months of eating cashews, her creatinine spiked dramatically. And then finally, 8 months after ditching the cashews and adopting a low oxalate diet, you can see that her kidney function improved considerably, but it didn't return to normal. Here's another case, this time an 81-year-old man. Again, his kidney function had always been normal in the past. The patient happened to be very health conscious, which is a recurring theme in most of these cases, and after being told that his prostate was becoming enlarged, he decided to improve his already healthy diet even more, and so he began consuming lots of nuts, as well as several teaspoons of cocoa powder, and he continued to drink lots of almond milk. This all added up to about 1,500 milligrams of oxalates per day. And you can see here the crystals that began to accumulate in his kidneys. After switching to a lower oxalate diet, his renal function improved significantly, but just as with the prior case, it never returned to normal. Now, interestingly, the clinicians who published this case decided to include a personal message from one of the patient's family members in order to give a real-life perspective. And I'm going to go ahead and read portions of that. To put this case in perspective, prior to falling ill, my dad was the picture of health. Just several weeks prior to his kidney failure, he was clearing heavy brush from his property and cleaning up a small landslide of mud that had run into his neighbor's property. He was not what most think of for an 81-year-old man. Through the admission process, I was so concerned that he would be stereotyped as elderly, as simply declining, and little would be done to restore his health. For as long as I can remember, my dad looked to his diet and supplements to fix anything that ailed him. With each new doctor that walked into the room, regardless of their specialty, he began to tell him about his diet. We are eternally grateful to our doctor for her determination and expertise in investigating and diagnosing the reasons for my dad's sudden kidney failure, and more so for her careful follow-up of his care from the point of diagnosis such that he has been able to regain kidney function, avoid dialysis, and resume much of his daily routine pre-kidney failure. My experience with doctors is that diet is not often discussed, or discussed at such a high level that my dad's diet would have simply been praised. I think doctors fail to ask patients about their diets, mostly because doctors know very little about diet and nutrition. They simply don't get the training. Anyway, here's another case of oxalate-related kidney damage caused by excessive vegetable juicing, in this case, baby spinach, Swiss chard, and beets. And here's a series of cases caused by the ingestion of star fruit. I'm not going to go through all the case reports in the literature, but here's an article that summarizes 23 of them. In each case, dietary oxalates were blamed for either causing acute or chronic kidney damage. Lastly, I want to end this video on a more positive note. Here's a case where a patient was able to essentially make a full recovery. This was a case of a 54-year-old man who again had always had normal renal function, but then he suddenly developed a kidney stone. At this point, his serum creatinine jumped up to 2.1. Normally, you want that number to be less than or equal to 1.2. But it's not unusual for this number to temporarily bump up when you're passing a stone. However, in this case, his number never went back down. Even 2 years later, it was still around 2.1. And then, over a period of 3 months, it got even worse. Fortunately, his doctors finally thought to ask the patient about his diet, and they discovered that over the past several years, the patient's diet mostly consisted of nuts. It was estimated that his total daily oxalate load was about 800 milligrams, which is approximately 4 times the average American consumption. When this fact was brought to the patient's attention, he quickly adopted a low oxalate diet, and then over the next few years, his kidney function gradually improved. His creatinine level eventually dropped to 1.25, again, normal being 1.2 or less. And his GFR, which is another measure of kidney function, went up to 59, normal being 60 or above. So almost a full recovery. So how compelling are these case reports? I should first say that case reports in general are not very high on the pyramid of scientific evidence. Case reports are generally not used to make any generalizations. This is because they have lots of limitations. For example, in the cases I presented, maybe it wasn't the oxalates that caused the damage. Maybe it was because their high oxalate diets also happened to be deficient in some vitamin or mineral, and it was this deficiency that compromised kidney function. And it was only after the kidneys were damaged that they began to accumulate oxalates. Why then did they get better on a low oxalate diet? Maybe it was because the low oxalate diet supplied those missing nutrients. Furthermore, you may have noticed that all the patients I presented were either middle-aged or elderly. They didn't have kidney disease at baseline, but maybe they had some other metabolic disease, and maybe that's what made them vulnerable. Maybe a younger, healthier person could have tolerated the same level of oxalates with no problem. I don't think these are likely explanations, but you cannot exclude them as possibilities. However, this does lead me to my next question. Are there any case studies suggesting that dietary oxalates might affect younger people, maybe even children? I'll talk about that in my next video. Stay tuned.